let's take you now to the U.S., where we find my colleague Sherwin Bryce Pease. And of course, this as the U.S. vetoing Algeria's draft resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The U.K. abstained. Let's get more details now. Sherwin, thank you so much for your time. I mean, the United States vetoing Algeria's draft resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Now, the UN also, the U.S. rather, repeating what it had said in the past, that this draft resolution will hinder negotiations, and there's a need for a demand that Hamas releases the hostages. Tell us more about how this vote went.
Well, Bongiwe, essentially, it's a movie we've all seen before. The US essentially choreographing this veto, coming out with a hard-hitting statement on the weekend, indicating that this veto was likely to happen because they do not believe the Algerian draft resolution would provide comfort to the negotiations, the diplomatic negotiations led by the United States and Qatar in the region, that they believe is the best bet in terms of moving this file forward. They believe the release of those hostages are critical to get Israel's acquiescence in terms of a temporary ceasefire, a temporary humanitarian pause that they believe will also then allow humanitarian aid to get into the Gaza Strip. Essentially, what they vetoed is this. Algeria was calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire respected by all. It called for the immediate release of hostages and that parties to the conflict scrupulously adhere to the tenets of international human rights and humanitarian law. And it also rejected the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. The United States vetoed this, the United Kingdom abstained, but 13 countries voted in favor. Let me give you a list of those countries: France, China, Russia, Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Switzerland, Algeria, Guyana, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone and Slovenia. And among that list of 13 countries, essentially a broad majority in the Council, are a number of US allies. So you're seeing this broadening of the gaps between where the United States finds itself in terms of wanting to give preference to the diplomatic efforts in the region and the rest of the Council. I think a number of Council members are infuriated that this weeks-long process undertaken by Algeria, soon after the provisional measures were handed down by the International Court of Justice, Algeria engaged in steadfast negotiations, a process that allowed for consultations with the 15 members of the Council. And so there is a frustration with the United States injecting a new draft resolution, its own version, at the very last minute when this Algerian text was going to be put to a vote. So a lot of frustration here in New York. But at the end of the day, Bongiwe, the same result: the United States vetoing a Council resolution, draft resolution, seeking to demand a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. It's a movie we've all seen before, not so.
And Sherwin, definitely. I mean, I'm wondering, though, how Algeria reacted to this, given the fact that, you know, we're listening to, the speaker earlier saying that if you are voting against, it's an endorsement of what is happening on the ground in Gaza. And you're also annihilating the dream for a better life, and supporting it means supporting the right of the Palestinian people to food, among others.
Yeah, and essentially they believe that the US veto here really undermines efforts to arrest the situation on the ground. A vast majority of countries, 155 countries, voted in the General Assembly months ago demanding an immediate ceasefire. But of course, that has not come to fruition. So Algeria, echoed by countries like China. Let me read you what Zhang Yun, the Chinese ambassador, said. He said that the US veto, Bongiwe, essentially green lights the continued slaughter in Gaza and risks igniting hell across the region. This is a view that is throughout, the majority of certainly the 13 members in the 15-member council, but also the majority of UN member states, right? You have the process unfolding here in the council. You have parallel processes unfolding at the ICJ. So diplomatic efforts are certainly being brought to bear on this file, but they are not delivering the results requisite to the need on the ground and the immediacy that certain countries really want to see an end to this conflict. They believe the 4 months have been enough. The death toll, the majority of which are civilians, women and children, reaching almost 30,000 now. There is a great sense, particularly from people like the Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, that has for months now been calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, that this was an opportunity lost here in New York.
And what happens now then, Sherwin?
Well, the United States has introduced its own draft resolution that it believes would provide an endorsement, essentially greater support to what they believe is the only game in town. And those are those negotiations led by Qatar and the United States. You know that Antony Blinken has been to the region many, many times. But even that deal, Bongiwe, is not coming fast enough. They believe that the council needs to support that process. They've introduced a resolution that speaks to that. It would also provide what they're calling a temporary ceasefire of up to 6 weeks. They believe the formula being negotiated in those negotiations, those diplomatic negotiations, would allow for all the hostages to be released in exchange for hundreds of Palestinians, and a temporary pause of up to 6 weeks, which would be, in effect, the longest pause we have seen today. They believe that those negotiations are the only way to get Israel's acquiescence here, to get Hamas to agree outside what would have been a legally binding resolution had this won the day today in the council, Bongiwe.
Quite interesting developments there, Sherwin, and as you say, more of the same. The script, really one could have written it as, you and I have spoken about what has happened over time there in the UN Security Council. But let's see then what happens next, as also the ICJ is hearing its public hearings. In fact, 52 countries making those representations there. And this evening, of course, we also heard even from Chile earlier on today, hearing from South Africa as well. But Sherwin, thank you so much for that update.